everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of VENDO Velocity. We're super happy that you decided to join us today. If this is your first time being on or tuning in for VENDO Velocity, it is our live podcast that goes live every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and we discuss the latest platform updates and strategy for Walmart.com, TikTok Shop, and Amazon. So I'm your host, Delaney Del Mundo, and I lead our Amazon and TikTok Shop teams here at VENDO. I am very excited to introduce you to a first timer on VENDO Velocity, Theron, who's behind the scenes making magic happen for all of us here at VENDO. And I give him credit for all of our process updates, everything that happens operationally here. When he came in, he was really able to do wonders for our process that has just made us more efficient. So I'll take a little bit of time to let him introduce himself here.
Thanks. Super flattering. I'm glad. I'm glad all the work I do behind the scenes has an effect. So yeah, just quick intro. So about the last 20 years or so, I've been in operations and project management leadership roles at a variety of agencies, and that's spanned anywhere from a three-person, just kind of a startup, all the way up to some of the enterprise level agencies that you see out there, especially in Chicago. Um, and I started with Vendo a few years ago, and it's been an amazing ride ever since. And I love working with this group of people, and look forward to continuing to optimize everything behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So we're switching things up a little bit, not direct strategy necessarily for Walmart.com, Amazon, or TikTok Shop, but very impactful as a business owner or agency owner or just anyone who's trying to further optimize their business. So we want to talk a little bit about change. And I think change is sometimes a difficult topic for people to come around to. If you were someone like myself, a few years ago, I was of the mentality that I really didn't like change because we know that that comes with just newness. And so what we want to discuss is we know change is hard, but how are we managing change effectively? And I think that within an agency world or within any business, prioritization is one of the most important things that you can be on top of because it can almost seem like almost everything feels like it's urgent. So I want to pick Theron's brain a little bit. And Theron, we'll start off by talking a little bit about in the world of change management, how do you prioritize when everything feels like an urgent risk? Are there
Yeah.
any frameworks or mental models that you think can help leaders understand what they need to tackle first?
Yeah, I mean, a part of it is it's this mental game, right? I mean, I'm fond of saying it's always going to feel like there's 100 fires happening at the moment, and sometimes you only have bandwidth to pick the three biggest ones. So that's essentially what I use to prioritize. I mean, what is causing the biggest loss, or what is causing the most amount of issues? I mean, and that seems to be for me a really targeted way to decide what's the priority. What I also like to do too, and most of the time, whether it's for a department or for a company, I operate off of a scorecard, and I usually kind of think in the agency world in terms of financials, in terms of delivery, and in terms of the organization. And I score a couple of different things under each one of those, and just to kind of get a sense of if we're doing poorly or well in certain areas, which areas are those? Which category does it fall under? And when I'm looking at the amount of things that could potentially be fixed, I kind of tie it back to the scorecard. So if we've got a list of proposed fixes to make, and one of them addresses something that we're fine with, versus another one addresses something that we desperately need, or a big uh, red area on our scorecard, that's the one I'm going to prioritize first, because at the end of the day, you're trying to have a noticeable impact on the business, and doing things that feel good and make you feel that it's, like feel like you're busy, versus figuring out what does the business need, what is the greatest impact that you can have. And that goes whether you're looking at it from a business standpoint or from a marketing standpoint. You're always trying to find what's the lever that I can move that creates the most change.
And I want to talk a little bit about the simplicity of change sometimes, because I
Yeah.
think that's where it can get tricky. I know in conversations that you and I have, I'll be like, Theron, why can't we make this a little bit simpler? But obviously, we've seen things work when they are more elaborate and really thought out operationally. So I want to hear from your perspective, the best solutions aren't always the simplest ones. And why isn't simple always the easiest to achieve in the context of change management?
Oh man, let me pull up this one graphic. Hold on, let me Google this. Slack. How Slack sends a notification. And I like to use this graphic when I'm trying to, or I'm talking about simplicity with somebody. I've got it here. So you can see this Slack image, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So what this is a diagram of how Slack chooses to send a notification. Um, and for the end user, it's always this simple experience of, hey, I got a notification or I didn't. And this is all of the thought process, or at least the notification code process that happens, and it has to validate a couple of things. So oftentimes what looks the simplest has a lot of planning that goes into the back end, and sometimes that starts off simple, but over the years, you might have seen somebody or received feedback from your user base that, oh, we need to be able to do different things, or I want this notification triggered at different points. And I know, when we're talking about change in our context, we're talking more about behavioral change, but there's a lot of um, kind of parallels with this graphic where we always think it's going to be simple, but there's a lot that goes on under the scenes of when does that behavior get triggered, in what conditions, and what are the exceptions. Who's actually going to, at least in this case, receive the notification, who's managing this, how do we audit it to find out if it didn't trigger. So it's this graphic is really just meant to show a point that um, on the surface level, we're always wanting simplicity, but even if it's simple on the surface, there's a lot that goes into it. um, the reason I tend to have to plan change so much is, I mean, you've been in like this type of situation where there's something that you propose or that a team member proposes, and it's going to address a problem, and one of three things will happen: either you'll you'll meet resistance and people won't accept the change, or people will accept it, have good intentions, but mess up along the way, or they'll get it right, or right enough, but then it doesn't last. And not only you've experienced this, millions of people have experienced this, and this is why the study of making change and making it stick has turned into a discipline all in itself, just because it's almost like a behavioral science in that sense.
That's what I want to talk about too, because for larger changes within an organization, the largest issue sometimes is adoption. So I want to talk through, how do you think we can more effectively motivate people to be more open to change?
Well, it's two things, right? So there's two motivators I think that most people have. One is avoidance of pain, and the other is chasing a win. The avoidance of pain one, that one, it's always the most direct, because if somebody, let's say they're having a bad client call because they didn't have something prepared, then part of the process change will be, hey, we're going to make sure you're prepared for this, and then that's an easy change for them because nobody wants to be on a client call and feel that. People are always going to default to, I mean, it's human nature to default to the least amount of effort to do a thing, right? So a lot of times when people are trying to, or are not following a process, it's because their experience, it's much easier to, hey, I did the thing, I didn't follow the process, but it's off my plate, and I don't care what parts of the process I didn't follow affect other people. At least the part that affected me, I got handled. And so they're choosing the least painful thing, which is, instead of maybe following a process which takes extra cognitive effort, they're doing the thing that they're just habituated to, and that's why it'll seem like they're not adopting the change or not. um, it's like trying to push the adoption for a lot of people, and then tapping into the motivation is one pillar of it. And part of that, aside from identifying the pain for somebody and figuring out how you can make your thing or your process or your change that you're trying to implement less painful, is usually part of the game and part of the planning. The alternative is the chasing of a win. This is tends to be why I like to have scorecards. Um, and sometimes the win can be an external one for the team, or it's an intrinsic motivation where somebody just wants to be a master of something. But as long as somebody can see how they're doing, and this is the importance of the scoreboard, because you can't tell if you're winning without knowing what the score is. And the score could be versus an old metric, versus another team, versus your competition. Whatever it is, you just kind of want to know the win. And those are the two things that motivate us the most. There's an example I loved from this one book where the presenter asked the audience, let's say you were on a 40-foot or a 40-story building, and across the way there's another 40-story building, and there's a 3-foot plank in between them. How much money would I have to pay you to walk that plank? And everybody has their price at some point.
Money.
You get up to saying $1 million or whatnot. But then he changes the question, and there are a few people that wouldn't walk, and he changes the question to say, okay, well, what if the building that you were on was on fire and collapsing? How much money do I have to pay you to walk the plank? Suddenly nothing, right? So we're always wanting to avoid pain, avoid the loss, and sometimes it's just trying to understand what the loss trade-off is between the new thing that you're trying to implement versus a person's current reality.
That's a really good one. I'm sure you'll be telling me that in the future. Like, act as if you're walking a plank, Delaney. No, for sure. That's awesome. I want to talk about some of the more unconventional tips or strategies that you found particularly helpful in managing change. I know you've spoken a little bit about a cheat sheet, so want to dive a little bit into what that looks like as well.
Yeah, and I'm gonna share another graphic, and it's not necessarily unconventional, because I feel like anybody who's a student of change will have used this, I think. Let me share my screen. This is
All right, perfect, great.
okay. So this is modified model of all of the things that you need to consider when you're trying to implement the change. I've modified this for myself, and I've added a box or two, or added a column. But essentially making sure that when I'm planning a change, I've addressed all of these things. So for example, launching a project management tool, and I'm going to just kind of peel back the curtain from it. A change that you lived through. Developing the vision for it was having a clear idea of what our current reality was versus the reality that we wanted to move to. The consensus was making sure that some of the key players, and especially executives at the top, were fully bought in. Making sure that we had training videos for everyone and can develop their skills in using it. The incentives, by working with each team, I was able to figure out what their pain points were, and so the incentives were the solving of certain pain points. The resources could kind of overlap a little bit with the skills when we're talking about training, but resources could also be time, because time itself is a resource. And then the action plan, when I gave everybody the migration plan and the rollout and all of that kind of stuff, that was very deliberate in terms of how that was planned and communicated. And you're living through it, where the adoption of that tool or those processes, it differs from team to team, and it's a constant evolution of how that change is pushed, how it's maintained, how it's monitored, and things like that. So, and actually that brings me to one other thing where, one of the columns that I would add here typically is what's the management of this, or what's the monitoring, because you can have all of these things in place, but if nobody's looking at the thing that you just changed, or nobody's looking at the metrics that produces, suddenly it stops and nobody notices, right? So with this project management tool, I can see usage stats for each user. I can see audit logs and audit trails, and kind of understand who's actually using it or not, or using it in a way that we need to or not. And then I could push that with those people or with those groups, just to make sure that that doesn't create a group of people who aren't using it, and then that slowly spreads.
So this is great, Don. I'm curious, how much of the time do you feel like I wonder if it differs project to project, but in each of these stages, right? How much of your time, as a percentage of your overall time, do you feel like is spent ideating on each one of these individual stages?
It's gonna differ from the change that you're trying to make. Oftentimes, you might skip ahead, or you might kind of understand that the change that you're trying to push maybe isn't that complex. This is really meant for more complex change, and there are times where the vision is a little bit murkier, and I need to spend more time on that column versus um, fact finding and doing all of the interviews to figure out where people's pain points are. So I don't have a prescribed amount of time that I would spend in each column. I tend to just need to use discretion on it.
Awesome. Cool. No, this is perfect. Thank you. I want to talk about wearing different hats in general when it comes to change. Do you see, and specifically in your role, you can see different departments interacting with change, some more effectively, some maybe less effectively. Is it better to distribute roles across the team when it comes to change management, or how should leaders approach that?
When you say distribute roles, what do you mean? To distribute who's managing the change, or distribute who's playing different roles within the change?
Playing different roles within the change.
Yeah, I normally don't start with a preconceived notion, because different change initiatives are going to require different skill sets and different champions. So, if I'm rolling out a project management tool, the people that I might look to have a greater part in it, I'll actually look for a mix of people that are very operational minded, because they have a clear idea of what they want to do. But I'll also talk to the people who hate process and figure out, okay, what's the simplest way I can build this, or make this work for you. So when I'm thinking about the roles in terms of rolling out the change, it's based on the team that you have. It's based on the change that you need to make. So you can't get around that. But as you speak about the different hats, and one of the things that I like to think of is, when I'm trying to look for change initiatives, there's three hats, or maybe more, depending, that I will look at myself as wearing: either the doctor, the architect, or the mechanic. From the doctor, you are, or maybe it's the detective before the doctor, right? So you're investigating and finding problems as the doctor. You're diagnosing and prescribing things. As the architect, you're actually building those things, and then as the mechanic, you're maintaining it, or you're like course correcting and tweaking it. And maybe there's another hat, the janitor hat, which is the part that needs to clean it all up and make sure it's running smoothly. So in separating those functions, I can sometimes think, or I can sometimes view myself as the owner of all of those hats. But when I'm trying to delegate a little bit more, I'll look for people who could wear some of those hats. So I may be the person who is playing the doctor and the architect role, but I may need somebody who has the bandwidth to play the mechanic and the janitor role, or vice versa. Sometimes I'm the person that's architecting it, but I need somebody else to do the investigation and the diagnostics, and also the prescription of what the change should be, right? So when you're talking about roles, yeah, again, it circles back to one of those hats, but also the team and the initiative.
That's awesome. Let's close this up a little bit with, once the change is actually implemented, then what levers are in place to make sure that the change is accomplishing what you intended it to accomplish? Do you feel like it's a negative thing if you are in the middle of change, or you have adopted the change and then you realize that that might not be the best for the organization, or that you're still having to make tweaks as you go?
That's always a tricky one, because on the one hand, if if the goals change in the middle of it, you want to be able to pivot and address those. But on the other hand, if you do that too often, especially as the person leading a lot of change, if you do that too often, you lose a little bit of credibility, and people lose trust in the initiatives that you will launch, thinking that the last few that you've launched have suddenly changed in the middle of it. Why am I going to bother putting in effort to comply with this change? So what I like to do in those scenarios is really kind of think of change as iterative. Like, let's just get version 1 out. We know goals are going to change, or the situations are going to change, or we're going to face new challenges and new stress tests to this thing that was working for the problems that we had. But the solutions that we build for today won't solve the problems of tomorrow. We'll have to build a solution for tomorrow to solve those problems when they occur. So thinking of things in terms of iterations and just getting people to those milestones can do a lot in terms of keeping the trust, but also maintaining the change as well. Part of that is monitoring it. So, for example, if somebody were to roll out a time tracking tool, the first milestone might just be getting everybody trained. The second milestone might be making sure that, okay, everybody's trained. Now, is everybody adopting? And then the third milestone is consistent adoption. And then after that, you can consider it launched, or you can use maintenance metrics to see, how week over week or month over month, how many people are staying consistent. So thinking of it in those terms helps you identify the goals, and also treats those goals as a little bit flexible along the way.
I said that would be the last question, but I actually thought of one more. From a training standpoint, one, accountability. If you're working with a larger group of people, how are you holding them accountable to that training? And then second to that, how do you adapt to different learning styles when it comes to developing that training?
Gotcha. So yeah, training is always a tricky one, and part of it, I think, is we focus a lot on the content, but what's really hard is demonstration of knowledge. And so a lot of the more developed training programs usually involve either a test of some sort, whether it's a written test or a multiple choice, or a demonstration of the process that you just learned, of you going through it and demonstrating it to the person who prescribed the training. I think that's the way to keep most people accountable. You can have people sign off and say they watched something, and you can ask them if they watched it. And some people might have watched it, but they won't retain anything. So really, for getting compliance and making sure that, taking this back to the beginning, that the thing that you're training them on solves a pain point for them, so they understand the pain that they're experiencing, or the pain that they're creating for other people, and tying it back to that why. So we have the why behind the training, and then the actual training itself. You mentioned different learning styles. I will try to normally do, when I can, if it's an in-person training, I'll use like a 3-part training. One, which is read the process. The second part is watch me do it, and the third part is let me watch you do it. Sometimes I'll call that guiding your cursor. Sometimes I'll call it building muscle memory. But usually that third part is the biggest difference between whether we think somebody understands something that they trained on, or they think they understand it but they haven't retained it.
No, those are all great points. And I think everyone that has tuned in here has gotten a lot of value from this podcast. So I'm really glad we were able to change things up a bit. If there are any specific topics when it comes to running your own business, being part of an agency, just in any context, please feel free to comment. I will drag Theron back onto this podcast, because I know I won't have to drag him. It will be his own personal choice. So we will make that happen. But Theron, really appreciate you coming on and joining us today and walking through this so thoroughly, and hope to have you join me again soon.
Yeah, I was glad to be able to come on. I mean, change is hard, and there's a whole set of strategies behind it, and I hope whoever was watching learned a thing or two.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week on VENDO Velocity. Bye.
There you go.